The winter of 1610 settled over the land around Chachtice like a heavy white shroud, not the sparkling snow of festivals or hunting seasons, but a mute cold that seemed to drain sound from the world itself. The leafless forests stood motionless, the dirt roads hardened like stone, and the sky hung so low it felt as though one could reach up and touch it. That night there was no blizzard, no howling wind. It was the stillness itself that felt unnatural. The group advancing toward the castle spoke little. They were soldiers and officials, men accustomed to death and the smell of blood on the battlefield. Yet that night their steps were slower than usual. The snow beneath their boots did not crunch sharply, but sank with a dull weight, as if swallowing each footfall. The torches in their hands burned steadily, their flames unshaken, casting light on rigid, focused faces. No order for silence was needed. Silence imposed itself. Chachtice Castle emerged like a massive block of stone rising from the hillside. Its dark gray walls, mottled by time, stood firm as though they had witnessed too much to care about new arrivals. The gate was not fully closed. It stood ajar enough for cold air to pass through enough to make one wonder why a seat of power would leave itself exposed. There were no panicked guards, no alarm, no hurried torchlight along the battlements, only an opening that seemed to wait. When the gate was pushed open, its hinges let out a dry groan that echoed through the night, the only reminder that this place still held something alive. Inside the inner courtyard lay under a thin layer of snow. Old footprints overlapped one another, blurred by frost and wind. No one ran. No one hid. The castle did not resist, nor did it welcome. It stood cold and indifferent, like a body long accustomed to being violated. The first smell that reached them was not that of fresh corpses or spilled blood. It was something heavier and harder to name, a mixture of damp, ancient stone wood smoke, soaked in over years, and a faint metallic tang lingering in the air. It did not strike the nose violently, but crept in slowly, clinging to the throat and forcing a dry swallow. This was not the scent of a crime just committed. It was the smell of duration of things that had happened long enough to become part of the place itself. They moved deeper inside. The corridors were long and narrow, twisting like the insides of some vast beast. Torchlight swept across stone walls, revealing dark stains, cracks, and surfaces worn smooth by countless human hands over generations. There were no cries for help, no sobbing, not even the scurry of rats. This emptiness was not born of sudden fear. It felt like the result of a habit carefully established, a place where even sound had learned to disappear. At a narrow stairway leading downward, the air grew noticeably colder. Breath turned into thin clouds. The torches illuminated smooth stone steps, and there they saw the first undeniable traces. A dark dried streak, no longer pungent, no longer vividly red, but distinct from the stone. A rusted lock discarded in a corner, a chain trailing into shadow. No one spoke, yet everyone understood. What had happened here needed no living witness to be told. The dungeon opened into a space heavy with weight. The ceiling was low, the walls thick, and the cold clung to the skin. In the flickering light, they saw unmoving bodies, some lying down, others frozen in positions that showed death had not come quickly. There was no chaos of a hurried massacre. This place bore the marks of a workspace, a site where actions had been repeated often enough to become precise. What chilled them most was not only what their eyes saw, but the sense that everything here had once functioned in order. There were no signs of sudden madness, no traces of large-scale resistance. Everything suggested that pain had been arranged, distributed, and maintained as part of a rhythm. The castle was not the scene of a disaster. It was the setting of a system. When they returned to the upper levels, the light grew warmer, yet the cold did not leave them. The great hall used for dining and receiving guests appeared almost excessively neat. A long table stood prepared dishes, aligned signs of a meal just finished or about to begin. There were no stains, no overturned furniture. This space did not reflect what lay beneath it. The contrast created a gap in understanding, forcing one to ask how these two worlds could exist side by side without collision. At the center of the room were signs that the castle's owner had maintained her daily habits until very close to the moment of the group's arrival. There was no trace of panic, no evidence of a hurried escape. Everything here suggested something else. What occurred below was not an exception to be hidden, but the foundation of the calm above. In that moment, a cold realization spread among those present. They had not entered a place overtaken by darkness. They had stepped into a space where darkness had been domesticated, arranged, and woven into everyday life. Evil, if it existed, did not need to hide in corners. It wore the garments of discipline, routine, and order. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, almost soundless. Chachtice Castle stood as it had at the beginning of the night, silent and unmoved. There were no screams carried by the wind, no sign that a tragedy had just been uncovered. Only a prolonged, heavy stillness, like an overture played long ago, and within that stillness came the understanding that the greatest horror was not the moment of discovery, but the thought that all of this had gone on in such order so regularly for so long that no one had thought it strange anymore. The silence of Chachtice Castle was not merely the silence of stone and snow. It was the outcome of a current that had flowed through generations, where power was not seized by chance, but passed down as an unquestioned inheritance. To understand how those corridors could contain such horror, while preserving a cold order, one must move backward through time, returning to the name that had covered this land like a long shadow Báthory. That family was not simply wealthy. Wealth could arrive and vanish destroyed by war or squandered by the mistakes of a single lifetime. Their power was of a different nature. It was bound to the land, to deep forests, to villages where people were born, lived, and died without ever leaving the name of their masters. In those regions, the name Báthory did not exist only on documents or seals. It lived in the way heads were lowered and voices softened when speaking of the castle on the hill, and in the belief that some were born to stand above the ordinary order of the world. From an early age, the children of the family were taught that power was not something one needed permission to use. It was part of them like blood moving through veins. They grew up learning not only to read and write, but to command. They learned to see others as units to be managed as figures within a larger order. Compassion was not forbidden, but it was considered optional, something to be used only when it did not weaken control. The stories told within the family were not tales of kindness or sacrifice. They were accounts of battles, of suppressions, of how a firm decision had kept the land from collapsing into chaos. Over time, these stories became lessons. They taught that cruelty, when placed correctly, was not wrong. It could be a necessary tool, even a mark of an effective ruler. That lineage produced people of sharp intellect and formidable will. Many became exceptional leaders and respected strategists. Yet from the same education emerged another side. When power is treated as a natural state, all external limits begin to blur. Law becomes something meant for others. Morality turns flexible, a concept that can be adjusted to serve a greater goal. In such an environment, severity was not seen as deviation. It was rationalized, explained through responsibility. A harsh punishment was not an expression of personal anger, but a lesson for the many. A ruthless decision was not emotional, but the optimal choice to preserve stability. Gradually, the boundary between necessity and excess, between order and violence, became difficult to discern. Elizabeth was born into this very atmosphere. From an early age, she was surrounded by unmistakable signs of rank. Castle's servants' rituals and expectant gazes. She was not taught to question power, but to bear it. Praise for her sharp intellect always came with reminders that such intellect existed to serve rule. Within the family, difference was not eliminated immediately. It was observed, evaluated, and if useful, reshaped. A strong temperament was seen as a good sign. A rigid will suggested leadership potential. Only when the difference threatened the collective order was it treated as a problem. And even then, the response was not healing, but control. This perspective created a constant tension beneath the admiration the family inspired. From the outside, they symbolized stability and strength. From within, they lived in a world where the pressure to be worthy of power never faded. Each generation carried the burden of proving that they were born to dominate, not to doubt. When power is viewed as destiny, it produces a dangerous consequence. Those who possess it begin to believe they have the right to define what is right and wrong. Morality ceases to be a fixed compass and becomes an adjustable instrument. If an action leads to long-term stability, it can be justified regardless of the cost. And when that justification is repeated often enough, it becomes belief. In this current compassion did not disappear entirely. It was placed beneath power, never allowed to stand beside it. It could exist only when it did not slow the machinery of rule. For those positioned lower, this created an unbridgeable distance. They faced not only authority, but an ideology that treated authority as natural and unapologetic. The sense of awe the Báthory family inspired came from this very consistency. Everything had its place. Everyone knew where they stood, yet within that clarity, a quiet unease took root. For when order is built entirely on power, anyone who holds it can reshape the world at will. There is no counterweight except the will of the ruler themselves. Chachtice Castle, with its cold corridors and suspiciously orderly rooms, was the tangible result of such a tradition. It was not a place where evil entered from outside, but where a concept of power had developed long enough to create its own reality. In that reality, everything functioned smoothly until one was forced to look directly at the price paid in silence. When power is treated as essence, morality becomes conditional. It bends to need, to circumstance, to purpose. And in that bending, what was once unthinkable gradually becomes normal. The blood of those born to rule does not by itself create monsters, but it creates an environment where without limits, monsters can grow without encountering resistance from the very order that nourishes them. Elizabeth grew up in a world where everything was transparent, yet untouchable. The walls around her were built not only of stone, but of ritual expectation and constant surveillance. From her earliest years, she was placed at the center of a system designed to observe, correct, and refine. There was no corner left for chance, no space for spontaneous emotion. Every gesture, every expression was noted, weighed, and measured against the model of a worthy heir. Her intelligence revealed itself early. She learned faster than other children her age remembered with ease and possessed an unusual capacity for concentration. The tutors brought in to teach her did not hide their surprise at the speed of her comprehension. Knowledge came to her like a natural current, without strain, yet that intelligence was not treated as a gift to be cherished. It was seen as a resource, a tool that had to be sharpened for a future role. Elizabeth's days were divided into precise segments. Study discipline ceremony. Everything unfolded according to a fixed order repeated until it became instinct. No one asked whether she enjoyed any of it. The only question was whether she had performed well enough. Praise was rare and rationed, always followed by higher demands. Satisfaction existed only briefly before the next goal was set. In that space, emotion became excess. Tears were discouraged, treated as signs of weakness. Laughter was also controlled, as too much joy could disrupt discipline. Elizabeth learned to keep her face composed, to conceal every inner response. She learned to remain silent, even when she wished to speak, because silence was often valued more than unnecessary questions. People were always present around her, yet no one was truly close. Servants lowered their eyes, tutors maintained distance, and relatives spoke in the language of duty and honor. Elizabeth was never without observers, but she lacked listeners. She lived surrounded by gazes, yet not a single one reached her as a child, in need of understanding. Her world resembled a perfectly constructed greenhouse. Every condition was controlled to ensure optimal growth. Light was measured, air stabilized, and no external element allowed to interfere. Yet that very protection created a fragile environment. In a greenhouse, plants grow straight and flawless, but they never learn to withstand strong winds or sudden weather changes. Elizabeth quickly understood that her value was tied to her ability to meet expectations. Each achievement reinforced her position within the family order. Each failure, however small, was remembered. This taught her an essential lesson. Affection, if it existed, was conditional. It appeared when she performed correctly and vanished when she failed to meet the required standard. Under constant surveillance, Elizabeth's imagination found no space to wander freely. Thoughts that served no concrete purpose were set aside. In their place, another ability took shape: the ability to observe people as structures to be understood and controlled. She learned to recognize strengths, weaknesses, and reactions in others. This was not empathy, but cold analysis formed from the need to adapt. Loneliness did not arrive as an obvious emptiness. It came like a thin mist settling gradually. There was no dramatic moment, no single event, only the sense that everything happened around her without truly touching her. She existed at the center of a world designed for her, yet remained separate from it. When intelligence develops in an environment devoid of affection, it does not naturally seek balance. It seeks protection. For Elizabeth, that protection took the form of control. Control of herself, control of emotion, and gradually control of what surrounded her. It offered a sense of safety she had never been given freely. Elizabeth's childhood was not stolen by poverty or overt violence. It was shaped by cold perfection. Everything stood in its proper place, yet there was no room for fragility. And within that carefully maintained silence, a sharp intellect grew without learning how to love. That intellect did not disappear. It continued to search for an outlet, and when it could not find one in the light, it turned toward more dangerous paths. The first signs did not arrive as a clear catastrophe. They appeared in fragments, difficult to grasp, like shifts in the wind on a day that seemed calm. At times, Elizabeth would be seated in the study when sudden exhaustion descended her body, growing heavy as if pulled downward. At other moments, the world around her felt distant sounds, warped light flaring too bright before fading away. These episodes came and went, leaving confusion rather than pain in their wake. At first, they were treated as fleeting weakness. A child studying too much bearing, too much pressure, needs more rest. But the episodes did not disappear. They returned without pattern, sometimes more violent, sometimes no more than a brief gap in awareness. Elizabeth did not always remember what had occurred during those moments. What remained was the sensation of lost control, the feeling that her body no longer obeyed her will. In a family accustomed to command and obedience, such uncertainty was terrifying. It could not be managed by discipline or ritual. It did not bow to authority. Tutors, servants, and relatives began to look at Elizabeth differently, not with pity, but with scrutiny. A brilliant mind, once expected to become a pillar, now carries within it an element that could not be predicted. Rather than seeking the nature of the illness, they searched for its meaning. In a world where science was faint and superstition crept into every corner, what could not be explained was easily assigned to the supernatural. Whispers began, first discreet, then clearer. There was something abnormal in the child's body, perhaps a sign of an unclean power, perhaps punishment or a warning. Elizabeth sensed the change, even though no one spoke directly. The distance that had always existed between her and the world around her now widened further. Each time an episode passed, she woke into an atmosphere of tension. Those nearby kept their distance, spoke more softly, and watched her longer than necessary. The silence around her was no longer only discipline. It carried fear. No one asked how she felt. No one explained what was happening. Elizabeth learned to recognize the vague signals in her body that preceded an episode and learned to endure it alone. She was not taught how to name pain, only how not to let it disrupt order. When the storm passed, the question was never whether she was well, but whether everything could continue as before. Rejection did not take the form of open acts. It unfolded more subtly. Opportunities for contact were reduced. Lessons were more tightly supervised. Praise grew scarce, replaced by caution. Elizabeth, once an unquestioned source of pride, became an unresolved question. And in a family unaccustomed to accepting questions, unease quickly turned into defense. The illness forced Elizabeth into a deeper awareness of her body. It was no longer a tool serving intellect, but a source of resistance. Each loss of control reminded her that she did not fully command herself. This created a profound contradiction. She was raised to dominate, to control, yet within her existed a force that refused obedience. With no comfort and no explanation, Elizabeth was forced to construct her own understanding. When pain is not acknowledged, it becomes a secret. When a secret cannot be shared, it becomes a burden. And when that burden persists, it begins to distort. The initial confusion slowly gave way to another feeling, quieter but more enduring. She began to feel betrayed, not by a single person, but by the very system that had shaped her. That system demanded perfection, but rejected fragility. It celebrated her intellect, then turned away when that intellect came paired with something uncontrollable. In Elizabeth's perception, the world around her was no longer neutral. It became a judging presence, ready to discard what did not fit. Anger did not erupt as visible rage. It accumulated silently, like water rising behind a dam. Elizabeth could not express anger openly, for she had learned restraint too well. Instead, the emotion sought another path. It became withdrawal, coldness, and a growing need to reclaim the sense of control she had lost. Each episode passed, leaving not only exhaustion, but resolve. Resolve never to let weakness be seen. Resolve never to allow pain to be turned into a weapon against her. And above all, resolve never to fall into the position of the pitied. In a world where compassion always came with diminishment, Elizabeth chose another path. When pain is not understood, it does not vanish. It finds a way to persist. For Elizabeth, persistence meant transformation. The fear others attached to her did not make her retreat. It taught her that difference was dangerous, and that the most dangerous figure was often the one unafraid of being misunderstood. Within the storm inside her body, something new took shape. Not weakness, but a quiet, patient anger, waiting for the moment when it could be released. Elizabeth's marriage did not begin with a choice, but with a decision calculated long before she was old enough to understand its meaning. In the world where she was raised, marriage was not a bond between two individuals, but a fusion of forces. It was treated as a necessary move on a board of power, where personal emotion held no strategic value. Ferenc Nadasti was a name well suited to such calculations. He was known not for refinement or diplomacy, but for war. His life was bound to battles, prolonged campaigns, and the reputation of an unyielding warrior. In the eyes of the court and the nobility, this was an advantage. A man accustomed to violence was believed capable of protecting territory, preserving order, and maintaining position through strength. The wedding took place with all the rituals required to affirm the alliance. Light music and congratulations surrounded the couple like a polished shell. Beneath that surface, there was no intimacy and no anticipation. Elizabeth entered the marriage with the composure drilled into her since childhood. She neither expected nor resisted. To her, this was simply another role in the sequence she had been prepared to assume. Ferenc regarded Elizabeth with the eyes of a man trained to assess value by function. He did not seek emotional connection or shared reflection. What he required was a wife suited to his rank, someone capable of managing the estate in his absence and preserving the image of stability around the family name. Elizabeth, with her sharp intellect and disciplined self-control, fulfilled those requirements precisely. From the beginning, distance was present. Ferenc spent most of his time on the battlefield where he felt most alive. Elizabeth remained behind, taking on the heavy responsibilities of the vast domain. There was little opportunity to form a personal bond, and perhaps no desire to do so on either side. This marriage was not designed to nurture affection, but to function efficiently. During Ferentz's rare returns, the atmosphere between them remained formal. Conversations revolved around territory resources and political alliances. War became the central topic, not only because it was Ferentz's profession, but because it served as the measure of his worth. Stories of victories, iron discipline, and the punishment of enemies were recounted without hesitation, often with pride. Elizabeth listened not with shock, but with cold attention. What Ference described was not foreign to her. Violence had always been present in her upbringing, though expressed differently. Here it was wrapped in honor and duty. Killing was not viewed as a sin, but as a necessity in the preservation of order. This perspective gradually took root, reinforcing the belief that strength and cruelty could coexist without contradiction. The marriage offered Elizabeth another lesson. She observed how Ference was celebrated for his severity. Actions that might have been condemned in another context were praised here. Violence, when framed as warfare and territorial defense, became a symbol of virtue. This established a new standard where moral value was measured by effectiveness and results rather than mercy. In her role as wife, Elizabeth did not seek comfort from Ference. Instead, she watched and learned. She recognized that in this world, those who inspired fear were often held in higher regard than those who appealed to compassion. Stability did not arise from understanding, but from suppression. It was a lesson consistent with her past experiences, now reinforced by living reality. The coldness between them did not generate conflict because both accepted it as natural. Ference did not demand closeness. Elizabeth did not expect that emotional protection. They existed in parallel, bound by obligation and power rather than feeling. Within that space, each continued along a separate path, carrying personal convictions and obsessions. When Ference departed for extended campaigns, Elizabeth remained within the vast castle authority, in her hands growing more visible. The marriage granted her not only status, but also legal power to rule. Her orders were obeyed, not because she was Elizabeth, but because she was the wife of a renowned warrior. This reinforced her position and gradually obscured doubts about her earlier abnormality. A marriage forged by power did not bring warmth, but it brought legitimacy. It placed Elizabeth within a structure where violence was honored, where iron discipline was treated as the foundation of peace. Within that order, moral questions did not vanish, but they were pushed aside. What mattered most was the outcome. And when outcomes were praised, the means ceased to invite debate. Violence in this context was no longer deviation. It became the new moral standard, repeated, reinforced, and passed on. Elizabeth did not need to learn this lesson from the beginning. Marriage to Ference merely clarified something she had already begun to understand. In a world ruled by power, compassion is a luxury. Strength, when celebrated long enough, rewrites the boundaries of right and wrong. When Ference left the castle to return to the battlefield, his absence did not create a noisy void. It was like a large door closing, revealing a space that had existed for a long time, but only now became fully visible. Elizabeth remained behind, not in the role of one who waits, but in the posture of one who holds power. Vast lands, villages, scattered between deep forests and open plains, all operated under her name. In the early days, work arrived in waves. Ledgers reports requests from local stewards and minor disputes among villagers. Elizabeth received everything with cold concentration. She did not view it as a burden, but as a duty. Order had to be maintained, and order did not sustain itself. It required a guiding hand, swift decisions sometimes without mercy. Elizabeth quickly proved that she was not a temporary ruler. Her commands were clear without ambiguity. She listened, but did not allow emotion to slow decision-making. In the eyes of those beneath her, she became the embodiment of stability. With Ference absent, no weakness appeared. Everything continued to function even more smoothly than before. Power, when exercised, continuously begins to generate a particular sensation. Elizabeth felt the shift in how people looked at her. cautious eyes, careful voices, and near absolute obedience. She realized that fear was more effective than persuasion. It required no explanation and no debate. It produced immediate results. Yet alongside that effectiveness came a void that was difficult to name. When the workday ended, when problems were resolved and order restored, Elizabeth returned to the silence of the castle. There was no one with whom to share the decisions she had made, no one to challenge or oppose them. Her authority encountered no counterweight, and that absence made it more absolute with each passing day. In that solitude, discipline became the primary instrument. Elizabeth believed that people required clear boundaries. Without limits, they would cross necessary lines. Punishments were applied not to satisfy anger, but to maintain deterrence. She did not see herself as cruel. She saw herself as effective. And in her world, effectiveness was the highest measure. Those under her learned quickly how to avoid error. Order was preserved not through loyalty, but through understanding that the consequences of breaking it were unpleasant. Elizabeth observed this change with quiet satisfaction. She had created a system that functioned according to her will, without her husband's presence, without reliance on anyone else. As time passed, power became habit. Elizabeth no longer hesitated before difficult decisions. Choices that once demanded reflection now came naturally. This did not arise from innate cruelty, but from repetition. When a method delivered results, it was reinforced and became standard. In the rare letters sent from the battlefield, Ference reported on battles, iron discipline, and punishments inflicted on enemies. Elizabeth read them with familiarity. War and governance, though different in setting, spoke the same language, the language of power of necessary suppression to preserve order. She recognized that she and her husband, though separated by distance, were operating according to the same logic, but the battlefield was loud. It moved. It had visible enemies. The castle was different. Here, everything unfolded in silence. Punishments were not displayed as victories, but carried out discreetly. That discretion gave Elizabeth the sense that she controlled everything. No one questioned, no one resisted. Her power went untested. Emptiness began to surface in moments when there was nothing to resolve. Elizabeth realized she did not know what to do with unoccupied time. She had no habit of seeking personal pleasure, no interest beyond management and command. When no problems demanded attention, she felt restless. Power, once a source of safety, became the only thing that filled the inner void. With no one to question her decisions, Elizabeth began to trust her own judgment completely. This brought confidence, but removed something essential: dissent. Without opposition, without external limits, power ceased to be examined. It began to turn inward, seeking expansion and affirmation. Elizabeth did not recognize this change at once. It occurred slowly, almost invisibly. A punishment is applied more quickly. A decision made without weighing long-term consequences. Each small step could be justified. And that very capacity for justification made everything more dangerous. In the role of the woman who remained behind, Elizabeth proved herself an effective ruler. But that effectiveness carried a cost she was not yet ready to acknowledge. Power, when it encounters no resistance, begins to deform. It ceases to be merely a tool for maintaining order and becomes a means of asserting the self and soothing inner emptiness. The castle remained quiet, the domain stable, and everything appeared to function as expected. Yet within that stability, something else was taking shape. Power was no longer constrained by its original purpose. It began to generate its own reasons for existing and expanding, and Elizabeth, the woman left alone in the vast castle, gradually became the irreplaceable center of that order, without noticing when the line between governance and control had begun to blur. The first boundary did not collapse through a great upheaval. It shifted because of a minor detail so small that at a glance it could be overlooked without noticing that anything had changed. In the system Elizabeth had built, small details were often where things were tested before becoming routine. The matter began with a trivial violation, A servant was discovered to have misplaced an item from the storeroom. It was not valuable, not enough to cause meaningful loss, and in many households, a reprimand would have sufficed. But in this castle, the incident was not treated as a personal mistake. It was placed within a wider context where every action carried meaning for the collective order. Elizabeth received the report with her customary composure. She did not show anger, nor did she display emotion. She read each line, carefully asked for necessary clarifications, and listened to how the stewards presented the matter. In her mind, the issue did not end with the missing object. It was a signal, a small fissure in the disciplinary system she had labored to maintain. She considered what would happen if that fissure were not sealed immediately. What a minor violation left insufficiently punished might lead to: carelessness, testing of limits, and eventually the weakening of order. In the logic she trusted, order did not defend itself. It required clear messages, and those messages had to be strong enough to avoid misinterpretation. The decision was made quickly, but not rashly. Elizabeth chose the punishment not to chastise the individual, but to send a signal. She wanted everyone to understand that no action was too small to be ignored, and no one stood outside the system of accountability. Justice, as she perceived it, lay not in leniency or severity, but in consistency. When the punishment was carried out, there was no emotional outburst. Everything unfolded coldly according to procedure. Elizabeth did not intervene directly, but her presence was unmistakable. It was known that the decision came from her, and that knowledge gave it more weight than any display of anger could have. The reaction around her followed her expectations. Silence spread quickly. Eyes averted. Footsteps grew more cautious in the corridors. The order was reinforced at once. No one dared to test it again. The system functioned efficiently, and Elizabeth registered the outcome with quiet satisfaction. At the same time, something else was taking place, subtler and harder to perceive. The boundary between necessity and excess had shifted slightly. No one spoke it aloud, but within the atmosphere of the castle, a new standard had just been set. For, once a supporting tool, was now elevated to the primary foundation. Elizabeth did not see herself as having crossed a line. In her reasoning, everything remained rational. The punishment was not an expression of anger, but a calculated choice. It did not serve personal emotion, but protected a greater order. She told herself that without such measures, the system would gradually slip beyond control. This very act of justification blurred the boundary further. When an action can be explained through reasonable logic, it no longer provokes strong inner resistance. Conscience is not attacked outright. It is simply asked to step aside, making room for what is labeled necessary. After that incident, similar decisions became easier. Elizabeth did not face sleepless nights or moral struggle. On the contrary, she felt a new clarity. Her world now operated on simpler rules. Those who complied were safe. Those who violated them faced consequences. There were no gray zones, no exceptions. The coldness in her rule was not innate indifference. It was the result of learning. Elizabeth had observed long enough to believe that people responded more reliably to clear fear than to vague counsel. She believed that pain, when applied correctly, could serve as an effective form of instruction, but any tool, when used repeatedly, tends to change its role. Pain ceased to be merely a means. It began to shape how Elizabeth perceived the world. She no longer asked whether a punishment was too harsh. The only remaining question was whether it achieved its purpose. Those around her sensed this shift. No one voiced it, but everyone adjusted accordingly. Order grew tighter, but also more rigid. The atmosphere of the castle carried a low tension, as if any mistake, however small, might trigger an unpredictable response. Elizabeth stood at the center of that order, composed and decisive. She believed she was doing what was necessary, and that belief became the final boundary, protecting her from self-examination. When pain becomes a tool, conscience does not vanish at once. It is set aside gradually each time another reasonable justification is offered. The first boundary was broken in this way. There was no collapse, no dramatic moment. only a small step taken with cold certainty and absolute faith that the world could stand, only if held firmly by fear. And when that step met no resistance, the path ahead appeared open, straight, and free of hesitation. News of Ference's death arrived without drama. It was not announced by tolling bells or frantic messengers. It came as a brief message carrying the weariness of those long accustomed to war and death. A sudden illness, a body eroded by too many years on the battlefield, and an ending without heroism. The warrior who had lived amid violence concluded his life in silence. Elizabeth received the news with reaction difficult to name. There were no tears, no collapse. She sat still, reread the lines, and felt a space open within her. Ference, the man bound to war and absence, was now gone entirely. No more letters from the front, no longer a name heavy enough to stand beside hers within the structure of power. In the first days of widowhood, Elizabeth did what was expected. She dressed in black, observed the ritual, and displayed the required solemnity. Yet beneath that exterior, there was no deep pain of personal loss. Their marriage had never been rooted in emotional attachment, and so Ference's death left no wound of that kind. What Elizabeth felt most clearly was a shift in order. Ference, though absent much of the time, had still been a counterweight. His existence, however distant, imposed a limit. A man of comparable authority, a name large enough to prevent Elizabeth's power from becoming absolute even in form. With his death, that limit vanished. The final tether, however loose, had been severed. The property lands and control Elizabeth inherited surpassed anything she had previously held. She was no longer a caretaker ruling in her husband's stead, but the legitimate master. Every decision now originated with her, without reference, without delay. The order she had maintained was now entirely in her hands, unbalanced by any external force. The first sensation was not exhilaration, but emptiness. With no counterweight for comparison, Elizabeth realized that absolute power carried a different kind of silence. There was no one to report to, no one whose approval was required. Everything proceeded with a smoothness that felt almost unsettling. Within that smoothness, she felt as though she were standing in a space too vast without support. Liberation arrived more slowly and in a distorted form. It did not come as joy, but as a cold relief. Elizabeth no longer had to adjust her decisions to accommodate the existence of another. She no longer had to consider whether her choices aligned with the image of a powerful marriage. The last restraints had dissolved. Her authority was no longer merely a tool to preserve order. It became the only space where she felt fully present. In the long days following Ference's death, Elizabeth realized she did not know how to live without governing. With no battlefield to mirror her actions, no husband for comparison, she turned inward toward her domain, searching for new challenges. That emptiness did not make her hesitate. On the contrary, it compelled action. A mind accustomed to solving problems could not endure a state without purpose. Elizabeth began to look around with a different gaze. The systems already in place could be tightened further. Rules could be clarified more sharply. Minor deviations, once handled individually, could now be placed within a broader framework. With Ference gone and the battlefield distant, the castle became the absolute center of her world. Every gaze, every decision pointed there. Elizabeth felt a focus she'd never known before. She was no longer distracted by external factors. All energy and thought were directed toward affirming and expanding her control. Within that distorted liberation, something dangerous began to form. Without external limits, Elizabeth faced no challenge. Every idea, every plan was judged solely by her own internal logic, and that logic, shaped by years of disciplined fear and legitimized violence, was no longer tested by an equal world. She began to believe that she saw what others could not, that only she possessed the clarity required to maintain order in a world filled with weakness. This confidence did not arise from fleeting arrogance, but from the sense that everything around her functioned better under her tight control. There was no resistance, no collapse. Only silence was preserved. Ference's death left no emotional void, but it opened an unlimited space of power. Within that space, Elizabeth was no longer required to see herself through the eyes of another. She became the sole standard. What was effective was right. What was necessary? Questions of limit gradually lost meaning. A mind without limits does not stop at managing what already exists. It seeks new objects to dominate, not out of malice, but out of inner necessity. Elizabeth, as the wealthiest and most powerful widow, stood before a world entirely open to her will, and in the absolute quiet that followed the death of the one who had held the chain, she began to move forward unimpeded, guided by a logic only she believed to be true. At first, Elizabeth did not recognize where the change was coming from. It did not arrive as a shock or a clear rupture. It slipped into her life slowly, almost politely, like an uninvited guest who was nevertheless allowed to cross the threshold. One morning, standing before the mirror, she noticed that the light fell differently on her face, not because the mirror had changed, but because she lingered longer than usual. Time had never been a concern before. In a world of power and discipline, everything was measured by efficiency and order. Whether days passed quickly or slowly was irrelevant as long as the system functioned correctly. Elizabeth was accustomed to controlling the rhythm of everything around her, but now there was an element that did not obey the command. The signs were subtle, a weariness that lingered longer than before, a faint crease that appeared and vanished depending on the light, a sense that her body no longer responded with the same sharp precision. None of these was severe enough to provoke immediate alarm. Yet their smallness was precisely what made them dangerous. They could not be punished. They could not be ordered away. Elizabeth began to confront a truth she had never faced before. Some things lie beyond the reach of power. Time did not care about order, about rank, or about the fear she instilled. It did not react to punishment. It did not require persuasion. It simply continued steady and indifferent. Panic did not erupt. It smoldered like a fire burning beneath a thick layer of ash. Elizabeth did not permit herself visible fear. She had learned restraint too well, but in rare moments alone she felt unease spreading, not because she was losing authority, but because for the first time she faced an enemy that could not be subdued. She tried to apply what was familiar: control, discipline, arrangement. Routines were tightened. Schedules became stricter. Her body was treated as another component of the system that needed maintenance. Yet, unlike others, the body did not obey with absolute precision. It responded slowly, imperfectly, and at times betrayed her. Elizabeth began to look at those around her differently. Their youth became uncomfortably vivid. Their freshness, their ease, and even the fragility she had once dismissed now served as constant reminders of what she could not possess. It was not jealousy in the ordinary sense, but a feeling of being challenged. Time gradually took on the shape of an adversary in her mind. It did not announce itself or declare war, yet it advanced relentlessly. Each passing day was another step taken by that enemy. What unsettled Elizabeth most was not its strength, but her inability to respond. There was no punishment capable of deterring it, no rule that could be imposed. That quiet panic began to affect how she perceived her own power. Absolute authority, she realized, was only absolute within the boundaries humans created. It could control behavior, fear, and social order, but before the limits of the body, it became powerless. Elizabeth did not accept this easily. She began searching for explanations, not through science or reason, but through less defined paths. When reason fails to offer satisfying answers, people tend to seek alternative understandings, not because they believe immediately, but because they need the sense that something can still be done. In discreet conversations, vague ideas about preservation and prolongation began to surface. No one spoke plainly. No one dared to assert certainty. Yet the whispers were enough to plant a seed. If time could not be punished, perhaps it could be evaded. If decline could not be entirely prevented, perhaps it could be delayed. Elizabeth did not act hastily. She observed herself first. Every small change was noted, every sign was analyzed. She applied the same cold logic that had once allowed her to rule her domain. A problem had been identified. A solution needed to be found. Only this time, the object was not other people, but her own existence. That sense of lost control made Elizabeth more withdrawn. Power was still there, but it no longer provided complete security. In its place arose a new need, intense and persistent. The need to prove that she was not bound by the limits imposed on others. Panic did not cause Elizabeth to collapse. It sharpened her focus. In her world, every threat had to be understood before it could be confronted, and time, the enemy that could not be ruled, became the center of that attention, not because it was stronger than power, but because it was indifferent to it. Absolute power in that moment revealed its deepest limitation. It could determine the fate of others, but it could not command the finitude of its own bearer. Elizabeth stood before that paradox, unwilling to submit, yet unable to find a clear escape. And in the prolonged silence of the castle, among corridors, where order was still maintained with rigid precision, a new obsession took shape. Quiet, unspoken, but strong enough to guide what came next. Time had become the first enemy Elizabeth could not punish, and for that very reason it became the most dangerous threat she had ever faced. Elizabeth's court was never proclaimed. There was no formal inauguration, no ceremonial unveiling, and it bore none of the familiar shapes of authority. It formed gradually in silence, like a structure growing on its own, around a center of absolute power. No one named it, yet everyone close to it sensed its presence as clearly as the cold seeping through stone corridors. After Ference's death, Elizabeth was not only the mistress of the domain, but the sole point toward which every decision converged. Power, once freed from counterbalance, began to generate its own pull. Those closest to it did not need to be summoned. They arrived on their own, drawn by stability, protection, and the opportunities only absolute authority could offer. These attendants were not alike, yet each filled a specific void in Elizabeth's world. Some served the need for belief. They did not argue or question. Their role was affirmation. When Elizabeth doubted, they reinforced. When she hesitated, they reassured her, not through reason, but through absolute agreement. That agreement created the sense that every thought she held was reasonable, every direction justified. Alongside them were the protectors. These individuals controlled the flow of information into the castle and to Elizabeth's ears. They filtered disturbances, softened unfavorable news, and shaped narratives in ways that minimized instability. Through them, the outside world grew distant and blurred. Murmurs of dissatisfaction rarely crossed that invisible barrier. Elizabeth was not entirely deceived, but she heard only what the system permitted her to hear. Then some handled the rougher tasks. They did not need to grasp the full picture. What was expected of them was readiness. Readiness to carry out orders never spoken aloud. Readiness to use violence when required, and more importantly, readiness not to ask questions. In this court of shadows, violence was not the objective. It was a contingency, always present, ensuring it rarely needed to be used. Finally came the organizers. They transformed will into structured decisions, into procedure. They recorded, arranged, delegated, and ensured that everything ran smoothly. Through them, Elizabeth's power no longer depended on her direct presence. It persisted even in her silence. The system continued to operate automatic and efficient. This court did not gather in a fixed location. It existed in private meals, brief encounters, and exchanges behind half-closed doors. There were no official titles, yet everyone knew their place. Silence was the shared rule. The most important matters were never fully recorded. They were passed through implication and mutual understanding. Elizabeth did not need to direct each individual. Her presence alone shaped the behavior of those around her. They learned to anticipate her wishes, to move a step ahead, and to avoid what might provoke displeasure. That initiative made the system even more efficient, as it no longer required explicit commands for every action. The prevailing emotion within this court of shadows was dependence. Each participant received something they needed: protection, indirect authority, or the sense of standing beside power. In return, they surrendered the ability to remain outside. Leaving the circle meant losing the safety it provided. Staying meant accepting unwritten rules. Elizabeth was aware of this structure, even if she never named it. She understood that power must be exercised through people. This court in the dark was not a gathering of conspirators in the traditional sense. It was a system operating on shared interest and controlled fear. Over time, dependence became mutual. Elizabeth relied on the court to preserve order and shield her increasingly decisive actions. The court relied on Elizabeth to exist. The relationship reinforced and protected itself, growing ever more closed. Responsibility was divided into such small parts that no one felt like the final bearer of it. Within such a system, evil did not require a distinct face. It did not emerge as personal intent, but as the natural outcome of seamless coordination. Each person performed only their task. Each task could be justified. And it was that capacity for justification that eroded moral boundaries without provoking strong resistance. The court in shadows did not produce chaos. On the contrary, it created a terrifying stability. Everything functioned in a correct place, role, and moment. Yet within that stability, something essential vanished. There was no space left for doubt, no room for individual conscience. The system replaced the individual in deciding what was acceptable. Evil rarely acts alone. It requires voices of affirmation, hands to execute, and structures to conceal. Elizabeth's court in the shadows was proof of this. Not loud, not ostentatious, only whispering, arranging, and waiting. And within that carefully organized silence, power continued to expand step by step, encountering no true limit at all. The first disappearances made no sound. They did not resemble familiar tragedies where cries rise and people rush to search for causes. They unfolded quietly, as if someone gently lifted a small stone from a path without altering its overall shape. A girl no longer appeared at the village well. Another did not return after a day of hired labor. No alarm was raised because no one was certain that anything unusual had occurred. These girls came from poor villages scattered across the domain. They had no influential relatives, no names recorded in important ledgers. Their lives were already fragile, bound to hard labor and dependence. When one vanished, the space she left behind was quickly filled by the survival needs of those who remained. Work still had to be done. Mouths still had to be fed. Rumors spread slowly, never strong enough to form accusations. Some said the girls had found better work. Others believed they had left to escape a poverty already written into their fate. Such explanations required no proof because they fit what society had learned to accept. When the poor disappear, the first assumption is not crime, but movement. In those villages, no one possessed the authority to ask large questions. Even when suspicion arose, it was quickly smothered by fear. Fear of being noticed, fear of being labeled troublesome, fear of confronting a reality they had no power to change. Silence, in that context, was not merely a natural response, it was a survival strategy. Elizabeth did not need to issue direct orders for each disappearance. The system had been made clear enough to operate without constant intervention. The attendants understood their roles. The organizers knew how to arrange matters. The executors did not need to see the whole picture. Each person saw only their task, and that very division rendered the full picture invisible. The girls chosen were not selected at random. They were those least likely to be searched for. No one waited for them to return to a crowded family table. No one felt confident enough to knock on the castle doors and demand answers. They were names whose absence did not disrupt the general order, and in the system's cold logic, that was the most important criterion. Their tragedy did not lie in the moment they vanished, but in how the world continued as if nothing had happened. Villages still woke each morning. Work was still assigned. News stories quickly replaced old questions. Each day that passed without response from above became an unspoken confirmation that those lives were not important enough to interrupt order. Some people sensed that something was wrong, but the feeling was not strong enough to become action. They looked around and saw no one else standing up, so they convinced themselves they had misunderstood. Silence, when shared by many, becomes easier to bear. It allows each individual to believe that responsibility lies elsewhere. Within the castle, disappearances were recorded as numbers, not in official registers, but in discrete reports. Lines of information are processed and passed through layers of the system. They were not mentioned as losses, but as outcomes. A procedure was completed, a problem resolved. Elizabeth did not confront individual faces. She did not need to. That distance was part of the protective mechanism. It allowed her to maintain an image of order without disturbance from specific details. The unnamed victims did not appear in her thoughts as distinct human beings. They existed as concepts, as elements required for the system to function according to the logic she believed was correct. That silent tragedy provoked no immediate outrage, and that was precisely why it endured. Without cries, without shocking images, society found it easy to turn away. Each disappearance alone was too small to become a collective issue. Yet together they formed a widening darkness where lives were consumed without a trace. Societal silence was not the result of complete ignorance. It was the product of choice. The choice not to look, not to ask, not to disrupt an order already fragile. Within that choice lived fear fatigue and self-interest. Whatever the reason, the outcome remained unchanged. The unnamed victims had no graves, no stories retold. Their existence was marked only by gaps in the lives of those left behind, gaps quickly filled by routine and necessity. And that ease was the most frightening aspect of all. A silent society is the first accomplice, not because it commits the crime itself, but because it allows crime to proceed without resistance. In that silence, the system is reinforced, power preserved, and the next victims continue into darkness with no one powerful enough or brave enough to speak their names. At a certain point, violence no longer appeared as an immediate reaction. It was arranged, categorized, and placed within conceptual frames that sounded reasonable. In the world Elizabeth had created, pain was no longer an unintended consequence. It became an element that could be anticipated, controlled, and used. This transformation did not occur in a single moment. It was the result of years of discipline, order, and gradual legitimization. When unnamed victims disappeared without provoking a meaningful response, the system absorbed a dangerous lesson. No clear boundaries were preventing it from going further. And where no boundaries exist, intellect constructs its own justifications. Elizabeth did not view what was happening as cruelty. In her thinking, these were necessary procedures. She began to name them with neutral, even academic terms. Rituals, experiments, assessments. Such language obscured the nature of the acts, turning pain into an object of study rather than a human experience. Each step was arranged with care, not to lessen suffering, but to achieve consistency. Consistency produced a sense of control, and control in Elizabeth's world meant safety. When everything followed the procedure, chance was eliminated. Pain became orderly, and that very order made it easier to accept for those within the system. Those within the Court of Shadows understood their roles clearly. The organizers ensured that every action followed a sequence. The executors obeyed instructions without question. The protectors ensured information never moved beyond permitted boundaries. Each person carried responsibility for only a small part. In that fragmentation dissolved personal guilt. Elizabeth observed everything from a protected distance. She did not need to confront each consequence directly. Reports were presented as outcomes, not experiences. Numbers and dry observations replaced personal stories. That distance allowed her to preserve the image of an order being perfected. Gradually, pain came to be seen as a variable, something adjustable, something that could be increased or reduced to achieve desired results. In this view, human beings ceased to be ends and became means. And once people are reduced to means, every moral boundary becomes negotiable. The horror did not arise from a single act, but from the coldness of the entire structure. No one screamed, no one lost control. Everything unfolded with a terrifying calm. That calm was the clearest sign of dehumanization. When pain no longer provokes an emotional response, a dangerous threshold has been crossed. Elizabeth believed she was pursuing knowledge. She believed understanding was the key to controlling everything, including human limits. Within that logic, observing and analyzing pain was not cruelty, but necessity. She convinced herself that only through understanding could she master what threatened the order and stability she had built. Yet intellect, when severed from empathy, does not lead to understanding. It leads to distortion. Concepts created to explain gradually became tools of concealment. Each new ritual, each new procedure was built upon what had already been accepted. There were no sudden leaps, only continuous descent. Within that system, even participants gradually lost the ability to recognize what had changed. When an action was labeled an experiment, it carried the appearance of inquiry. When called a ritual, it acquired solemnity. Language does not merely describe reality. It shapes how reality is perceived, and here language became an ally of inhumanity. Elizabeth did not see herself as deranged. On the contrary, she believed herself the most lucid figure in a world filled with weakness and pretense. In her eyes, conventional moral limits were barriers constructed by fear. By crossing them, she believed she was approaching a higher level of understanding where everything could be explained and controlled. The horror of the science of pain lies in the fact that it requires no hatred. It is not driven by rage or fleeting pleasure. It is driven by logic, a cold, consistent, self-reinforcing logic. Each result justified the next step. And when results failed, it was not the method that was questioned, but the subject. When intellect serves madness, it becomes more dangerous than instinct. Instinct has limits. It flares and subsides. Intellect builds, expands, and sustains complex structures, extending destruction in silence. Elizabeth, with her sharp mind and unchecked authority, created a system where pain was organized like a science. Within the cold spaces of the castle, those procedures continued to operate day after day, without noise, without display, only with enough rationality that no one inside felt compelled to stop. And it was that rationality that made the entire structure most terrifying of all. Illusion did not appear as an obvious lie. It arrived softly, almost kindly, like a whispered promise offered to those who could no longer endure the truth. For Elizabeth, this moment was not tied to a miraculous discovery, but to a growing sense of impasse. The tightly organized procedures, the legitimized experiments, delivered none of what she sought. Time continued to move forward cold and indifferent. The greatest fear was not pain, but failure. Failure to control her own body. Failure to prove that intellect and power could overcome human limitations. Elizabeth did not allow herself to confront that possibility directly. In her world, every problem had to have an answer. If no clear answer existed, then there had to be one that could be believed. Legends began to surface in those gaps, not as a declared doctrine, but as scattered fragments. Ancient stories resurfaced in discrete conversations. Vague notions of renewal, of transformation of youth, preserved through unorthodox paths. No one asserted them as fact, yet no one rejected them outright. Elizabeth received these stories not with naivete, but with desperation, disciplined into order. She did not believe blindly. She weighed, analyzed, and compared, but the danger lay in the fact that she was not searching for the truth. She was searching for the possibility of continuing to believe she had not yet lost. In that state, the boundary between reason and myth grew thin. Blood within these legends was not described as a symbol of violence, but as a transformative element. Youth was not framed as surface beauty, but as vitality. These ideas were vague enough to resist verification, yet concrete enough to awaken hope. And hope, when every other path is closed, becomes irresistible. A surreal atmosphere began to envelop Elizabeth's world. Rituals were added to procedures that already existed, not because they proved effective, but because they created the sense that something was being attempted. When reality yields no result, people accept explanations that are not entirely rational, as long as they allow action to continue. The court in shadows adapted quickly. Those who served reinforced the stories. The protectors ensured that doubts did not spread. The organizers transformed hazy ideas into concrete steps wrapped in formal language. Myth does not exist in isolation. It is sustained by a system willing to protect it. Elizabeth did not see herself as superstitious. She believed she was exhausting every possible avenue. In her mind, rejecting a path simply because it was not widely accepted signaled intellectual weakness. If the world did not yet understand that, did not mean the world was right. That logic allowed her to move forward without stopping to question herself too deeply. Yet that logic was itself the clearest expression of desperation. When people refuse to face the truth that some limits cannot be crossed, they cling to myth as a lifeline. Myth requires no proof. It only needs to be compelling enough to cover fear. For Elizabeth, that fear was not death, but helplessness. Symbolic rituals were repeated not because they produced clear results, but because repetition created the sensation of progress. Each performance postponed acceptance of failure. Each postponement delayed confrontation with the central question. What if all of this were futile? What if renewal did not exist? Desperation did not manifest as collapse. It existed like a dense fog, distorting perception. Elizabeth continued to control, to decide, to maintain composure, but internally the center had shifted, from seeking understanding to sustaining belief, from verification to preserving fragile hope. In that world, myth became refuge. It allowed Elizabeth to continue acting without accepting that her efforts might lead nowhere. It gave her a story to tell herself, one in which every act had a meaning, where pain was not meaningless, but a step toward greater transformation. The illusion of renewal did not need to be true. It only needed to be strong enough to prevent psychological collapse. And that was why it became dangerous. When people cling to myth to avoid facing truth, they lose the ability to distinguish hope from self-deception. Every contradiction is reinterpreted. Every failure is seen as incomplete, incorrect, or simply premature. Within the cold spaces of the castle, amid procedures that had become ritual, Elizabeth continued down that path, not because she saw light at its end, but because turning back meant staring directly into emptiness, and that emptiness to her was more terrifying than any myth ever created. The mistake did not arrive as a careless misstep. It emerged from confidence stretched too long from the belief that every rule had already been mastered. In the world, Elizabeth built silence had once been her most loyal ally. It concealed the dark spaces and softened dangerous edges. But some silences cannot endure when those who disappear are no longer nameless. This time the girls did not come only from poor villages. They carried surnames, lineages, and ties interwoven with other families. Their absence could not be explained by familiar assumptions. No one believed they had quietly gone away. No one accepted that they had simply vanished from banquets and ceremonies that had been part of their lives. Questions emerged more quickly. They were no longer whispered at wells or by hearth fires, but exchanged in drawing rooms and studies. Families began to inquire among themselves, connecting scattered fragments of information. Coincidences became impossible to ignore. Gaps in social calendars stood out more clearly than any rumor ever had. Elizabeth sensed the shift in atmosphere before it was spoken aloud. Eyes that once lowered now lingered. Conversations that once ended quickly now stretched with caution. The order of silence built on fear and dependence began to crack when fear changed direction. It no longer pointed toward the power at the center, but toward the anxiety of those who had voices of their own. The court in shadows responded by habit. The protectors attempted to soften the news. Explanations were offered careful and vague, but this time they lacked force. When families of standing began to ask questions, those questions carried a different weight. They could not be dismissed like complaints from lower ranks. The mistake lay in a system accustomed to choosing targets incapable of response. Once that boundary was crossed, every mechanism of concealment weakened, not because the system had grown weaker, but because the object of fear had changed. Those with voices did not accept silence as a safe option. Tension spread quiet but persistent. Feasts grew thinner. Visits were postponed. Relationships once solid began to show distance. No one accused directly, yet everyone sensed that something was being hidden. And when concealment becomes a shared topic, it speaks louder than any declaration. Elizabeth faced a new reality. Her power remained intact in name, but no longer functioned smoothly. Each decision was now weighed by those outside the system. The silence that once protected her had become a sign of suspicion. The more tightly things were held, the more attention they attracted. Those within her inner circle began to reveal unease, not because they doubted Elizabeth, but because they understood the limits of power. They were accustomed to operating in darkness, where no one strong enough could shine a light. But attention from influential families could not be extinguished easily. It spread through relationships beyond familiar boundaries of control. This mistake could not be corrected by a single decision. No punishment was strong enough to restore silence. No explanation is simple enough to end doubt. Once questions were posed by those with voices, they persisted until answered. And that persistence exposed the core weakness of the system. Elizabeth understood that her authority rested on society's passive acceptance. When acceptance turned into suspicion, power did not vanish at once, but it lost its foundation. Every subsequent action became defensive. Every choice was shaped by the need to contain attention. The prevailing emotion was no longer cold control, but sustained tension. Not panic, but the sense that every step might make noise. The castle, once a space of tightly held order, now felt resonant. Every small movement could be heard. The mistake could not be hidden because it had reached those who could not be silenced. Power sustained by fear met its limit when fear ceased to flow in one direction. Those with voices did not fear being forgotten. They feared losing their children, their honor, the social order they believed protected them. And that fear was stronger than restraint. The signal of collapse did not arrive like thunder. It came through changes in how people looked and spoke, through refusal to accept silence. In that context, the mistake was no longer an isolated incident. It became the beginning of a chain reaction that could not be reversed. Power exists only while fear does not reach those with voices. Once that boundary is crossed, every structure of concealment begins to shake. Elizabeth still stood at the center, but for the first time she recognized that some sounds cannot be silenced. And those sounds were announcing that the carefully built order was approaching a moment that could no longer be kept hidden. The investigation did not begin with public outrage. It began within the framework of order carried out through cautious procedures and the cold language of legitimate authority. When families with voices could no longer be ignored, the machinery of the state moved in its familiar way. Not hastily, not emotionally, but through calculated steps designed to avoid shaking more than necessary. The hunter appeared not as a hero, but as an agent of stability. He carried authority, not anger. In his view, the task was not immediate punishment, but the restoration of order through the exposures of truth. That very calmness made everything colder. When justice arrives in silence, it offers no comfort through emotion. The first questions were posed neutrally. Who went where when? Under whose authority? There were no direct accusations, only comparisons. Gaps in accounts began to surface as fragments of information were placed side by side. A single coincidence could be dismissed. Many coincidences arranged correctly became a pattern. Those summoned first were not figures at the center of power, but links farther out, people are accustomed to following instructions, yet never required to explain the entire chain of actions. Before official authority, their habitual confidence faded quickly. They were not coerced through violence. They were guided by the precision of the questions. Testimonies began to appear fragmented and cautious. No one claimed a responsibility beyond their own portion. Each person recounted only what they had done, what they had been told, and what they believed to be normal within a system that had existed for a long time. That very normality, once recorded, formed the most disturbing picture of all. The investigation did not seek dramatic moments. It sought consistency, repeated descriptions, orders that never needed to be spoken aloud, shared assumptions about what was permitted. When the testimonies were aligned, a network emerged. Not a network of madmen, but of people so accustomed to dividing responsibility that they no longer saw the collective consequence. The exposure unfolded slowly, layer by layer. No single confession was sufficient to explain everything. Instead, there was an accumulation of small details that, once assembled, left no room for denial. The system that had operated in darkness was pulled into the light by its own logic, procedure against procedure, order confronting order. Elizabeth was not the first name to appear in the testimonies. Her name surfaced as a point of reference, not as an actor in direct action. This reflected the way the system had been constructed. Power at the center did not need to act. It only needed to exist for everything to revolve around it. And that existence now became the central question. A cold atmosphere settled over the castle as news of the investigation spread. There were no longer protective whispers, no longer the certainty that silence would suffice. Those who had relied on the system began to understand that it was being dismantled through legitimate tools. There was nowhere to hide when order chose to examine itself. The hunter did not need to hurry. Time was on his side. Each new testimony added not only information, but pressure on those who had yet to speak. The coldness of the procedure rendered emotional reactions meaningless. Here there was no room for justification through good intentions or ignorance, only the question of what was done and why it had been allowed to happen. Justice in this form was not vengeful. It was reorganizing. What had been pushed into darkness was brought into the light to determine its true place within social order. This did not erase what had occurred, but it prevented it from continuing in silence. The exposure did not produce an immediate storm. It resembled a gradual drop in temperature, making everything rigid and brittle. Relationships once built on an unspoken understanding began to fracture. Promises of protection lost their value when confronted with a higher authority. A system that had once reinforced itself now began to disintegrate. The investigation did not aim at public opinion. It aimed at recordable truth. Each testimony was preserved. Each detail was cross-checked. There was no room for forgetting. That preservation made everything irreversible. Once truth entered the record, it existed independently of any individual will. Justice arrives late, but never by accident. It does not appear randomly, nor does it act on emotion. It comes when conditions are ripe, when fear changes direction, and when those with voices must be heard. The hunter, in the name of order, did not create the tragedy. He merely revealed what had already existed, hidden long enough to seem as though it would never be seen. In the cold light of the investigation, everything lost the ambiguity that had once protected it. Actions once named with neutral terms now faced their real consequences. And when a network of crimes is exposed through the language of order, there is no return to the silence that once sheltered it. The sentence imposed on Elizabeth was not pronounced in a public square, nor marked by the sound of a gavel striking wood. It required no audience. Power had decided that exposure at this stage was unnecessary, even dangerous. A public trial would have opened too many questions, not only about her as an individual, but about the entire order that had allowed everything to happen. So the sentence was carried out in silence, in the manner most fitting to what Elizabeth herself had once built. She was not condemned by words. She was stripped of position. No more commands were issued. No more reports arrived. No more shadow court whispered its affirmations. Elizabeth's power was not directly denied. It was neutralized by isolating its source. This time, silence was no longer her instrument, but the wall that enclosed her. The confinement did not resemble a conventional prison. There were no bars, no ranks of guards stationed at every door. Elizabeth was kept within the very space that had once been the center of her authority. Familiar rooms became boundaries. Corridors that once echoed with obedient footsteps now answered only with emptiness. The space itself did not change, but its meaning did. The decisions surrounding the sentence were framed as measures to protect order. Not punishment, but prevention. Not revenge, but closure. Elizabeth was no longer seen as an agent of disruption. She became a problem to be managed, and the most effective way to manage her was to remove her from public life without killing her. The suffocating sensation did not come from material deprivation. Elizabeth was not starved, not tortured. She was given the minimum required to exist. That existence itself was the irony. She lived but no longer existed. No one came seeking her counsel. No one feared or deferred to her. She was excised from the flow of the world, while forced to watch time pass day after day. For someone who had once controlled everything, this isolation was the most refined punishment. It did not attack the body. It attacked the role. Elizabeth had defined herself through the ability to rule. When that ability was taken away, she faced a void that no ritual or myth could fill. There was no system left to lean on, no subject left to dominate. The irony lay in the fact that this punishment used the very logic Elizabeth had once imposed. The order was preserved by removing the disruptive element. She had believed pain could be organized, controlled, and used. Now her absence was organized in the same way. No noise, no emotion, only efficiency. The world beyond continued to function. Investigations closed the necessary chapters. Those who had served were held accountable according to their degree of involvement. A new order was arranged carefully and discreetly. Elizabeth's name was mentioned no more than necessary. It was not erased, but it was no longer invoked as before. Selective forgetting became the final seal. Within the narrowed space, Elizabeth confronted what she had avoided her entire life. Finitude, not of the body, but of influence. She could think, remember, and analyze, but she could no longer act. Every conclusion, however sharp, ended in silence. For a mind accustomed to shaping the world, this was the deepest form of confinement. There was no moment of clear enlightenment, no resounding confession, only the repetition of day and night, each day, indistinguishable from the last. The irony was complete. Elizabeth had sought to conquer time. Now she was handed over entirely to it. Time became the sole warden, impossible to bribe, impossible to threaten. A sentence without a courtroom did not require public consent. It was designed to protect a broader structure of power by sacrificing the presence of a single individual. Elizabeth was not declared a monster. She was handled as an element to be removed from the equation. That approach made the punishment cold and effective. The greatest punishment for a ruler is not death. Death ends all questions. The greatest punishment is to be stripped of presence, forced to exist in a world that no longer needs you. Elizabeth lived in a space of memory and consequence, where all the power she once held was reduced to echoes no one heard. In that isolation, there was no victory for anyone. Order was restored, but the cost had long been paid. The sentence closed a chapter without a final sound. It left behind a cold lesson, not for an individual, but for the system itself. Power can be built in silence, and it can be dismantled in the same way. When everything ends, what remains is not judgment, but the emptiness where presence once existed. Elizabeth's death arrived in silence, exactly as she had lived her final years. There were no tolling bells, no gathering crowds, no solemn rites to mark the moment. Time simply crossed a boundary, without ceremony, leaving behind an empty room and an absence where a presence had once been. For the outside world, the event caused no disturbance. Order had been restored long before. Death was merely the closing gesture of a chapter that had already ended. Elizabeth left behind no final words. There was no last attempt at justification or defense. Silence settled over the ending like a fine layer of dust, obscuring the final details. Perhaps after so many years stripped of presence, death was only the natural continuation of being erased from shared life. She was no longer a subject of power, nor an object of justice. She became a memory, already beginning to change shape. It was within that void that history and myth began to merge. What was recorded in dry documents proved insufficient for human curiosity. What had been hidden invited imagination all the more. Scattered fragments were filled in with retellings, with exaggerated images, with fear passed from one generation to the next. Elizabeth was no longer simply a person. She became a symbol. In the stories that followed, the boundary between fact and invention blurred. Actions that required no proof were embellished. Gruesome details were amplified to match what listeners expected to feel. Myth did not concern itself with accuracy. It cared about impact, and that impact was nourished by a fear that had existed long before Elizabeth's death. History, by contrast, tried to keep its distance. It recorded, compared, and categorized. It spoke of context, of systems of choices made within a particular era. But history is never fully detached from the emotions of those who write it. Gaps in the record became openings for myth to enter. And when those two currents met, what remained was no longer a clear portrait of a single individual, but a layered and uneasy legacy. That legacy does not reside only in terrifying stories. It lies in how societies remember and use them. Elizabeth Báthory became a convenient warning, an image onto which every horror could be concentrated, so the world could claim that evil belonged to one specific person. Yet that convenience concealed something more important. Evil does not emerge from nothing, and it rarely exists alone. Looking back, what occurred cannot be separated from the system that allowed it to endure. Power was granted without restraint. Silence was maintained through fear. Lives were treated as interchangeable. Elizabeth did not act in a vacuum. She was the product of an order that valued efficiency over humanity, that treated fear as a legitimate tool of governance. Myth makes the story easier to remember, but also more dangerous. When evil is given the shape of a monster, people tend to believe they are safe as long as they do not resemble it. They forget that the actions leading to catastrophe do not begin with blood and darkness, but with small decisions, justified, accepted, and repeated. The legacy of fear, therefore, lies not in the horrific details, but in the lessons so often overlooked. It reminds us that power, when left unchecked, will seek to expand. That fear, when used as a tool, will return to shape the entire order, and that silence, however neutral it appears, always sides with the strongest force present. Elizabeth's silent death brought no release. It did not close the questions, but allowed them to drift forward through time. Each generation retells the story in its own way, reflecting its own anxieties and obsessions. For some, it is a tale of a monster to be condemned. For others, it is evidence of the cruelty of a distant age. But at a deeper level, it is a mirror held up to dangers that never disappear. The dragon in this story does not bear a single name. It is the image of the desire to control, of the fear of decline, of the belief that ends can justify means. That dragon did not die with Elizabeth. It sleeps within every system that allows power to operate without challenge, within every community that chooses silence as a form of safety, within every individual who believes they would never cross the line. The legacy of fear does not require us to remember every detail precisely. It asks us to recognize the pattern, to see how history can repeat itself, not through identical acts, but through similar logic. When power is unbounded, when fear is exalted, and when people refuse to face the truth, the dragon awakens again. Elizabeth Báthory will forever hover between history and myth in collective memory. But the lasting value of the story does not lie in separating those two strands. It lies in its ability to make us pause and question what is being accepted around us. In the gloom of its ending, there is a quiet but persistent warning. This story is not only about a monster of the past, but about what can happen when fear is given authority and when people forget their responsibility toward the power they help create.